Great. Yeah. And then I think without any further ado, let's get started. So yeah, Abby, will you talk us through what modern slavery is?
Sure. So modern slavery is an umbrella term, and we define it in our research at WikiRate as comprising of two principal components, and that's forced labour and forced marriage. And both of these refer to situations of exploitation, and crucially, exploitation that the person can't refuse or leave. And this could be because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, or abuse of power. So as you'll see on the screen here, our 2021 global estimates indicate that there are 50 million people in situations of modern slavery on any given day. So that's either people forced to work against their will or people in a marriage that they were forced into. And this number quite shockingly translates to 1 in every 150 people in the world, which I think really brings to home how widespread this issue is. So we'll look into some more detail shortly about the project, but our Beyond Compliance project is concerned principally with supply chains. So our key focus for this is the number of people living in forced labour, and that's 28 million people, with over 3 million of those being children. So as is usually the case, it's those that are already in situations of vulnerability that are affected greatest. So those dealing with poverty and social exclusion, those migrant workers or working in the informal economy, and also people subject to discrimination and living in contexts of crises. And this point is really crucial, I think, to why this work is so urgent. We're living in a world of compounding crises. So we've seen pandemics, the continuation of armed conflicts, and the ever increasing risk of climate crises. And all these factors lead to huge disruption in employment, in education, in people's lives and well-being. It increases poverty, distress migration, and gender-based violence. And all of these factors serve to heighten risks of all forms of modern slavery. So it really is a growing issue. If we could go to the next slide, please, Lorraine. So with the issue of forced labour growing and with companies becoming larger and more powerful with complex global supply chains and driven by intense consumer pressure, it's never been more important for companies to be taking action against modern slavery and really recognising their role in this issue and how they're potentially perpetuating this issue. And so it's really encouraging that governments have responded by introducing national reporting requirements. And these require companies to disclose their assessments of modern slavery risks in their supply chains. And this type of legislation is growing around the world, particularly in Europe. We're seeing more examples of this type of legislation coming up. But the two that we focus on in the Beyond Compliance project are the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts. And this is because the acts are quite similar. So they require companies over a certain financial threshold to release an annual statement on modern slavery. But they also differ in some quite significant ways, which we look at within the project. So what they consider legal compliance is very different across both. So in the UK, we see that the legal requirements are really minimal. So companies over a certain threshold are required to produce an annual statement, to have it signed by the board of directors, and to have a link to this statement on their company homepage on the website. So effectively, a company that's operating in a really high-risk industry could produce a statement that literally says, we have no reason to believe that there's any modern slavery risks in our supply chains. And that would actually be legally compliant if that was signed by the board of directors and on the company homepage. So in a kind of step further, which was really encouraging to see, the Australian Act, which was launched a few years later, goes a step further. It has a list of reporting criteria which places a far greater onus on companies to actually engage meaningfully with the essence of the legislation. So they have to report on policies, on risk assessments, on grievance mechanisms, staff training, just to give an idea of some of those factors. But it really engages more in actual protection for workers rather than a box-ticking legal compliance approach. So what is issued as mandatory under the Australian legislation is only guidance in the UK, and that's a key point that we use in our advocacy work. So despite these changes, these differences, a key issue under both acts is the lack of penalties for companies that either fail to comply to the legislation at all, or whose reporting standards are incredibly poor. And this really limits any avenues for accountability or any kind of governmental avenues for accountability. And that is where the Beyond Compliance project comes in. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Lorraine. So the Beyond Compliance project has been a work stream between Walk Free and WikiRate for about 6 years now. And it's really enhanced our understanding of business responses to modern slavery legislation. So we take a sector by sector approach where we look at companies' reporting standards within a particular sector. And that not only includes a set of indicators that Lorraine is going to talk through in a bit more detail later, but also specific risks in that given sector. So we work with experts and do an analysis of risks that are known in particular sectors, and then rate companies by their engagement with those risks too, as well as standardized metrics. And so far we've looked at the hospitality industry, the finance industry, asset managers, and most recently the garment sector. And our next report, which we're working on at the moment, looks at statements produced by the energy sector, in particular the renewable energy sector. So really this is a project about accountability. Sorry, if you could just go back to the previous slide, Lorraine. So it helps us identify gaps in modern slavery legislation, and we're able to form recommendations for improvements. It helps us to analyse and compare reporting standards under the two acts, so looking at those differences that I previously mentioned, and how those differences in legal compliance changes or doesn't change the level of engagement that companies have with each act, and ultimately holds companies to account and drives industry standards. And also, as I mentioned, it helps us to conduct targeted and informed advocacy with policymakers, with businesses, with investors, and also encourage activists. So like yourselves, encourages activists to use our data to really help with the aims of our project and enhance accountability ultimately. So how is the data used? So primarily we produce a report each year on the research. So like I said, a sector specific report. You can see some of those on the screen now. We also produce spotlight data for our flagship research project, the Global Slavery Index. So the Global Slavery Index provides national statistics that breaks down estimates of people living in modern slavery at the country level, and also provides an analysis of vulnerability and risks to modern slavery, both at the country level and internationally. And it's a really important piece of research, and it informs baseline data used by governments around the world, used by media outlets, and some of our Beyond Compliance data informs the Global Slavery Index spotlights. We also engage in high-level forums such as the United Nations, the European Parliament, and you can see a photo there of Lorraine speaking at the UN about the project findings. So yeah, we're able to make these really high-level partnerships and really get this data into the hands of those that can use it to affect the greatest change. We also conduct direct advocacy with governments using the data. So, like I mentioned, we call for the strengthening of modern slavery legislation based on the evidence that we found. So most recently, we've worked with both the UK and Australian governments, pointing out where our findings show that the legislation isn't quite meeting its essence. So, for example, around that reporting requirement piece, around the penalty piece. And also we recently worked with the New Zealand government on their bid to establish a Modern Slavery Act. And we were able to present this data showing how companies are currently engaging with legislation that exists and where New Zealand could enact stronger legislation that would go even further. And also we run online campaigns, which I'll chat in a bit more detail about later. So now over to Loreen.
Great. Yes, thanks, Abby. And so I want to start by talking through another way that we are using the data, which is that we developed a data dashboard just last year, which hasn't been launched yet, but we are already using it, and we're wanting to show you a little bit what we found, because it's a way in which we can aggregate all of the work that's been done under this project. So let me just see if I can get in there. Yes. Okay. Are you able to see the dashboard, or am I still, just to check? No. Okay. Then I'm gonna have to stop this share for just a minute and share another screen. Just bear with me. Here we are. No, sorry, that is still the same. Here we go. Yeah. PowerPoint was taking everything over. So, right. So here, really what you can see is, the dashboard that we developed, and it summarizes everything that's been done. So the data is being live pulled in from the WikiRate platform. So this is all up to date. Whenever anyone adds a statement or adds more data, that will show here immediately. And you can also from here click into the WikiRate database to really dig a little bit deeper into what is really behind the stat, what companies, what exact disclosure, what sources. So from there you can really kind of dive a little deeper into the data. And there's a few things in particular I wanted to highlight. So the first is this minimum compliance piece, where Abby was already explaining that actually, especially under the UK Act, you don't need to do that much to be compliant. And as you can see, it's just those three things in addition to having a statement, right? And even so, we're seeing not even 1 in 4 companies being compliant, which is quite surprising when you realize that these are really large companies. They have 36 million pounds turnover per year. So they would have their own corporate lawyers, right? They have access to resources that can actually help them. And you can see there's generally, high rates of compliance with the different individual indicators, but not with all of them. And that's why the overall minimum compliance is very low. And then when we go to Australia, it gets even lower, as you can see, which is to be expected given the number of requirements that are there, minimum requirements, but still 3% is shockingly low. So that's one thing I wanted to just highlight. Other than that, I wanted to just briefly show you the differences that we're seeing between sectors. So for instance, you can see that garment in comparison to the financial sector and hospitality sector is more transparent. They're talking about more things in their documents. In general, for all of the things we're looking for, they disclose more of that information. And that is actually quite understandable, because there's a lot of advocacy organizations working on that sector because it's very consumer facing and consumer action is more present. So you can already see by just engaging more with that sector as a consumer, you're having impact on what companies are telling us and give it what information they're giving us to understand what they're doing, which is great. And then yeah, one other thing I wanted to highlight is, of course, a very low figure of company statements that talk about particular incidents they found. So knowing how big this issue is, as Abby was showing us, like there's nearly 30 million people working in forced labor conditions. Now you would expect, of course, many more companies to find these incidents in their supply chains, because the idea is if you look hard enough, you will find it. That's the unfortunate situation. But that also shows that if we are not finding it, maybe your due diligence isn't good enough. And one thing that I always like to just briefly touch on as well is the remediation strategy. So out of all of the indicators, one of them is actually looking at what do you do when you find an incident of forced labor in your supply chains. And it could be that you're talking about a specific case you found and what you did, but it could also be you haven't found anything yet, but if you were to find it, what would you do? And this I find a very telling indicator, because it shows us how companies are approaching this issue. So first is that more than half are not talking about it. So they're not talking about what they would do if they were to find it, which is already, I think, quite surprising when you realize that the entire document is about eradicating modern slavery. Then the second thing to notice is that canceling contracts is the most commonly talked about remediation strategy. And the least talked about is worker remediation. Now, what that tells us is how are companies approaching this issue, right? They're seeing it as a risk to themselves, which they want to disassociate with the moment it's found, rather than that they want to resolve the exploitation that is happening of the people involved. And so it's a risk exercise for them rather than for people who are vulnerable to exploitation. And so, yeah, even when we're just looking at what companies themselves are telling us, these kinds of larger trends, by doing this research at this scale, we can find these interesting insights. And that's the kind of information we can take back to governments and saying they haven't understood yet what it is you're trying to do. Yeah, so maybe the last thing I wanted to touch on here that could be really helpful is to show you, of course, there's a lot that's happened already. The research that we've done, we've covered over 1,000 statements to date under this project, which is the largest effort of assessments for these legislations. But as you can also see, we have a whole lot more statements that need assessing. And so this is really where also this effort comes in, and where we're looking to bring more people into the fold of this project, because yeah, we need more manpower. There's way more companies, there's way more statements than there's people like us. And so, yeah, let's work together and let's try to make a difference here. So let me just stop sharing again and bring my slides back up just for a moment. There we go. Yeah, that should do it. Yeah, so this is this point where I can tell you, yeah, how you can get involved. So we're looking for people to join us as data contributors. And that's just a fancy way of saying we need more people to look at what is in these statements and to report that through the WikiRate platform into our database, so that we have a better overview. We know more about companies, and we can hold more of them to account. Now, what does that really mean? What kind of actions does that include becoming a data contributor? Well, the first is to actually assess these documents, right? So it's reading the statements and answering questions about the document. What kind of information can you find in it? The second is that when that information has been extracted, we do peer reviews, right? So we don't just rely on one person. We always look for at least 2 people to agree on a particular answer for that question. So it's a way of verifying and doing quality assurance. And then there's the third step, which is getting the findings out there, talking to the world about what it is that we were able to uncover. And this is, you can be part of all of these tasks. You can be part of 1 or 2 of these tasks. It's up to you to indicate where your interests lie and where your capacity is as well to get involved. But we need help with all of these. So any kind of contributions and any kind of support is very much appreciated. Now, what are the questions? I say answer questions. Well, okay, this is where we get a little bit more technical, but not to worry. We'll go through it step by step, and there will be more training and materials to help you as well, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But maybe just first to say, there's a number of questions that we've defined, as you can see here in the description column. And they're all based on the guidance that comes with these two legislations. So there's the UK legislation and the Australian, and we've mapped them to a number of questions that what is the kind of information we're expecting companies to disclose in these documents. And as you can see, some of the questions are mandatory, some of them are not, but there's still guidance on what companies should be disclosing. And so we included it. And that's how we can really measure that difference between compliance and beyond compliance. So the questions go across a really broad, kind of easy to answer to like a very complex question to answer. It's whether there is a statement, how did they publish it? Did they put it in a registry because the national governments have their own registries, or did they maybe put it on their homepage? Is there board approval? Is there a signature? So those are all the kind of characteristics of the statement. But then we also get into things like, what is their organizational structure? Are they talking about that? Or are they talking about their business model? And this is really helpful because even that can influence modern slavery. It tells us a little bit more about the leverage they have over forced labor cases. What could they do, and where are they limited in what they can do? Or maybe do they need help? Do they need to collaborate with other stakeholders in their supply chain? And then we're also looking at, well, what does their supply chain look like? Are they telling us where they're operating with their supply chain? Are they telling us maybe who their suppliers are? Now that's of course rare, but for instance, in the garment sector, this is more common because they will actually talk about this because there's been a lot of advocacy for them to publish their list of suppliers. And these are, of course, direct suppliers, right? So yeah, we have a lot more information there. And that is just to kind of sketch out the landscape, right? Like, what are we looking at? How complex is your supply chain? How likely are you working in areas where people are more vulnerable to exploitation? And then we get to a metric that is looking at policies. So what are the commitments? What are the practices that companies say that they will want to follow? So are they prohibiting forced labor and child labor explicitly in their communications internally and with suppliers? Do they have some kind of clause in their contract with suppliers that talk about these issues? Do they maybe talk about wages or labor rights standards more generally so that they can make sure the workforce is in a safe work environment? So there's all of these kinds of elements that you go and look for. And that continues. So then we get into the risk area. Are we looking at how are they assessing their risk in their supply chain? So what are the tools that they are using to make sense of the risks that they are facing? And then we get into, well, once you have identified that risk, what are really the management tools that you have, right? So you do your assessment, you identify what types of risks you have, then how do you manage that risk? Are you engaging with your suppliers? Do you do audits? Are you visiting factories? And of course, if you're doing that, you're going to visit, for instance, your high-risk suppliers in a particular region. Are you finding incidents? Now, and that's where you would then expect them to say, yes, we found something, or we found something that could be a vulnerability to exploitation or precursor. And that could be things like wage theft or holding back of documents, things like that, right? Well, and then, of course, if you find an incident, what are you going to do about it? So what is that remediation strategy that we just talked about as well? And then, so that's the whole kind of risk piece that we look at, an incident identification. And then we also go into, well, another way to find incidents is, of course, a whistleblowing mechanism. Is it possible for people to report red flags or to report suspicions that they have? And yeah, is that mechanism working? Are you maybe also protecting people from retaliation if they were to report something? Do they feel safe enough to talk about it? And we go on to things like also training. For instance, are you teaching staff how to recognize incidents or how their work might impact exploitation? For instance, with people who are working in purchasing practices, do you talk about lead times and pressure on price and how that might affect a workforce in a particular country? Yeah, and from there, if that is all talked about, we even go and look at performance indicators. So are they measuring their own performance on these types of issues? And also, are they measuring how their business practices more generally are impacting forced labor? So for instance, if they say, well, you know, we're going to move our production to a different country, does that change their exposure to the risk of modern slavery? Are they more likely to exploit people by doing that? Or if they're going to do a franchising model, they're going to acquire a new company, are they measuring these kinds of business decisions and looking at what the effect is on modern slavery? And last, there's also an indicator that looks at whether, if this is only for Australia, this is relatively new, the UK, we don't see a lot of that. It's also not part of the guidance, but it's saying, well, there's a lot of group statements, right? So companies are often not just one kind of entity. They have multiple arms and branches and subsidiaries, and maybe they're reporting on behalf of these subsidiaries. We see a lot of group statements. Well, are we talking to the management of all these different entities? Are you consulting with them? Are they involved in the production of the statement? Are they also covered by these policies? And yeah, so are they part of a consultation process for this document? And that's what the Australian Act is also asking companies to do. So that's in a really quick kind of run through, what is it that we're really looking for? What is the type of information that you're going to be looking for when you assess a statement? Yeah, so then what's next? What can you expect? Well, we're definitely in this together. So you're not going to be sent off on your own to go and do something. There's a lot of community around this, and you'll be joining a group of over 40 volunteers who are going to be doing this research. And what you'll be getting out of it is that we're going to be teaching you lots of skills. You're going to learn how to assess these documents, how to make sense of company disclosure. We provide guidance documents, there will be training, and there's discussion spaces where all the researchers will be posting questions and helping each other out to make sure. And the funny thing is, people always think, well, once you've been doing this for 6 years, you must know. Well, of course, we are familiar with the material, and we know quickly what to recognize and what to look for. But even the most seasoned researchers in this project still have questions, and we still discuss, are you sure? What do you think? Because company disclosures can be quite tricky. So there is definitely this really collective process of making sense of all this information. So what you'll be doing is working with experts from the field, people who've been doing this for years, people who are also working on the impact side, who are talking to governments, who are going to these forums. So you'll be learning a lot from these experts. You'll meet like-minded individuals who are really driven to have an impact, and you'll be contributing directly to a campaign that is going to have an impact. And yeah, Abby can tell you a bit more about that in just a minute. But before, I'm going to share the next slide. Yeah, so this is the moment where you have a bit of a peek behind the curtain. What is it that a data contributor is? Is it something for you? Are you wanting to get involved in this way? And if you do, we would be so happy to have you. You can click on this link. Lucia will also post it in the chat, and you can sign up to become a volunteer. We'll also share the link in a follow-up email after the webinar, and you can indicate whether you're wanting to get involved and to what kind of degree, if there's any of the particular tasks that really appeal to you. Please indicate your interest ideally by Monday the 21st, because we'll be organizing the training and all of that. However, if you cannot sign up right now, or your capacity is not there right now, but you would love to get involved in a month's time or later, you can still get involved as well. This is an ongoing project, and we really are always looking for committed volunteers. So yeah, don't worry if now is not the time. There will be more chances, and we would love to hear from you when you're around. Yeah, so then back over to you, Abby, to talk a little bit more about what our goal is going to be.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. So I mentioned earlier that online campaigns are a really big part of what we do with the data. And the most recent of these was focused on the garment sector. So it took the findings that we had in our garment report and really distilled these into a campaign encouraging the driving of standards within the garment sector. So as Loreen mentioned, the garment industry is well known as having significant modern slavery risks, and that's why we saw that there's generally more kind of uptake of the legislation itself. So there's been some really high profile coverage of wage theft in the garment sector, of major factory disasters. You may have seen these yourself, and that's why we see more engagement publicly from garment companies. So garment companies saying that they care about the human rights of their workers and ethics. But what we have to be really careful for here is greenwashing. So companies can quite easily sort of window dress and make consumers think that they are really responding to modern slavery risks. And actually part of our project is finding out, are they really? Is this greenwashing? Or are those claims true? So overwhelmingly, our garment sector research from earlier this year found that companies are approaching the legislation as a box-ticking exercise. So really, although we see that higher compliance, the quality of the compliance and the quality of the statements was not far different from any of the other sectors we've looked at, which really disappointingly and overwhelmingly was a lack of meaningful engagement. So producing a statement, but not really engaging with policies, not engaging with workers that are working beyond tier one of their supply chain. And we know that beyond tier one, the risks of modern slavery only become greater. So this is an area we'd really love to get your help on. We've done the initial garment sector report, but we want to look at more statements in the garment sector and inform a campaign. So you'll see here the campaign that we launched earlier this year. We encourage people online to let their favorite fashion brands know that they care about the people that make their clothes, and that we're encouraging them to engage with the legislation more effectively. And with Christmas coming up, we thought that this was a great time to do more of this. So to re-engage with the campaign with more data, more statistics, updated statistics, and really let companies know that consumers care and encourage consumers to shop ethically. So this is something that would be excellent to get people's help on in the coming weeks and months. As Ari mentioned, this type of pressure really does work. It does drive standards. We need to let companies know that they're being watched and that we're demanding change. So you'll see, if you follow our socials, you will see the re-engagement of this campaign, and hopefully it will involve statistics that you're helping us with. So if we go on to the next slide. I thought it would be good to end on this slide. So ultimately, this project is about the 50 million people living in modern slavery worldwide. And it's about shining a light on that. So we work at WikiRate with survivors of modern slavery across all areas of our work. And I'd like to highlight this quote from Nasreen Sheikh, who is one of the survivor activists that we work with. She was working in a garment factory, forced to work in a garment factory in Nepal as a child, in appalling conditions, and managed to escape those conditions and is now an incredible activist. So her quote here: "I hated those clothes, woven with the energy of my suffering. At the end of the day, I would collapse into the large bundles of clothes and daydream about where they would end up and who would wear them." So without laws, researchers, activists, and advocates, modern slavery remains a hidden issue, and people like Nasreen, you know, that a light isn't being shined to let companies know that we need change. And that's what the Beyond Compliance Project is. It is that light, and will ultimately lead to more and systemic change in industries. So please join us. And now we can open up to some group conversation.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Abby, for sharing that and what our goal is going to be. I can say also just a little bit more about numbers, right? So we're looking at assessing at least 100 statements before the Christmas period, where we'll be talking very specifically about companies who were assessed last year. How are they doing 1 year on? How has the campaigning affected their reporting? Did it affect their reporting? Especially also, are some of the companies we found not to have a statement, are they producing statements now? So there's a lot of this kind of like, let's check what is happening. But beyond that, we have another 250 statements from garment companies that haven't yet been checked. So to really help us assess that full garment sector that is reporting under this act, that's what the goal is of this drive. And as I already said, there's 40 other plus volunteers that you'll be joining. So yeah, you won't be alone going at all of these high numbers. There will be lots of engagement opportunity and working together. Great. So maybe, yeah, I don't know if there's any questions or, yeah, things that you want to share. If anyone has anything, please feel free to just unmute yourself and share with the group.
I was maybe wondering what the next steps would be after I fill out the form. What happens next?
Yeah, so on Monday, we'll take stock of the number of people we have, and we'll start to plan, and we'll be looking at like time zones and things like that, and we'll be planning in a training. The first training is already scheduled to happen next week, Wednesday in the morning. So we'll be looking to see if that will be sufficient for those who have signed up, or whether we would be setting up another training. So yeah, it's as soon as next week, the first kind of activities would start. And then it will be about kind of, we'll do a coordination around the number of statements you'd be looking at and what are the timelines and things like that. So yeah, you can expect an email as soon as Monday about concrete next steps.
Okay, great. And you're looking specifically at the garment sector at the moment?
At the moment, we're looking to do a rerun on the garment sector, but there is other sectors to look at as well. And if you are interested in another sector, we can actually already get you working on another sector as well, or a particular company. If your interest is for a particular group of companies, we can also do that. So there's a lot that's possible. So if you do have preferences, feel free to, mention that in the form, and we can make sure that that your interests match our needs.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent.
And on that note, I just wanted to share that I did share the volunteer form via the Q&A window here. Maybe we can post it in the chat. But as Lorraine is saying, for those who have not opened it yet, there are like different sections in which you can share what is your availability, what is your interest in particular, and your time zone, which is of course important for us to organize. So yeah, looking forward to see what is the response.
Yeah, and it'd be great. So the form is also there to make sure that we don't start to just kind of chase people who have signed up to a webinar but don't actually want to get involved. So we won't, for those who have just joined the webinar, we won't be writing you about trainings or anything like that unless you filled out the form. But what you can expect if you have joined and signed up for the webinar is to get the recording and to get just an overview of all the things and a link to the form as well to indicate whether you want to get involved in the next part of this. Great. So is there anyone else who has any questions or things they would like to discuss? If not, then we are 2 minutes before time, which is perfect. Then I can give back just a couple of minutes to everyone. And would just really like to, end with thanking you all for being here and taking the time to go through this. And yeah, we're really excited to be working with a number of you on this. So yeah, let's get this done. All right, have a really lovely evening. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.